man I'll call Marcus went to St. Simon's Island 3 years ago to write a paper on coastal Georgia history. He was a researcher, a skeptic, a man who trusted documents and dates and things he could hold in his hands. He did not believe in hauntings. He did not believe the dead could reach across centuries and grab the living. He told me that himself. But when I spoke to him 8 months after he came back from that island, he was not the same person. He had lost weight. He wasn't sleeping. And every time I asked him what happened at Dunbar Creek, at the place the locals call Igbo Landing, his eyes would go somewhere else. Somewhere I couldn't follow. He told me he heard them. He told me he saw something in the water that he could not unsee. And then he told me the one thing that broke me. The thing that made me realize the story needed to be told. He said, they weren't haunting that place. They were guarding it. This is that story. Hashtrick. Script Beejins. Before we go any further, I want to be clear about something. What you're about to hear is rooted in real history. The people at the center of the story were real. Their suffering was real. Their courage was real. And the place where it happened, Igbo Landing on St. Simon's Island in Glynn County, Georgia, still exists. You can go there. You can stand on that ground. And if you do, you'll understand why this story has survived for over 200 years, passed down through the Gullah-Geechee communities, who have always known the truth of it, long before any historian ever wrote it down. I'm not here to sensationalize their pain. I'm here because what happened there, and what people say still happens there, deserves to be heard. Now, let me take you back. The year was 1803. The transatlantic slave trade was still a grinding, brutal machine. Ships crossed the ocean carrying human beings in conditions so horrific that the mortality rate on some voyages reached 40%. The people who survived a crossing arrived in ports along the American coast broken, disoriented, stripped of their names and languages and families. Most of them never saw their homeland again, but the group that arrived in Savannah, Georgia, in May of that year was different. They were Igbo, somewhere between 70 and 75 men, women, and children, from what is now southeastern Nigeria. The Igbo were known, feared, even by slaveholders, for something that made them dangerous in the eyes of anyone trying to control them. They had pride, deep, unshakable cultural pride, a spiritual system that valued personal sovereignty, a belief that death was not the end, that the spirit returned home, that the ancestors were always watching, that to submit to a life of chains was worse than any death the body could suffer. The slaveholders didn't understand this. They saw it as stubbornness, defiance, a problem. They had no idea what that defiance was about to cost them. The Igbo captives were purchased at auction in Savannah by two plantation owners, John Cooper and Thomas Spaulding. The price was around $100 per person. That's what a human life was worth to them. A number on a receipt. The captives were then loaded onto a smaller coastal vessel, a schooner called the York, to be transported down the coast to the plantations on St. Simon's Island. The crew of the York was small, a few sailors, a couple of overseers. They were outnumbered, and they knew it, but they didn't expect trouble. These people had just survived weeks in the belly of a slave ship. They were supposed to be broken. They were not broken. Somewhere during that short voyage down the coast, the Igbo rose up. It wasn't chaotic. It wasn't random. Accounts suggest it was coordinated, purposeful. The captives overwhelmed the crew. Some of the sailors went overboard. At least one overseer did not survive. The Igbo took control of the vessel. And then, and this is the part that changes everything, they did not try to sail back to Africa. They did not try to navigate the ship to freedom. They knew they couldn't. The ocean was too vast. The world they'd been stolen from was too far away. Instead, they ran the York aground in the shallow waters of Dunbar Creek on the western shore of St. Simon's Island. And then they got off the ship, and they began to walk, according to the oral tradition preserved by the Gullah-Geechee people, the descendants of West African captives who have lived along the Georgia and South Carolina coast for generations. The Igbo stepped off that ship and walked into the water of Dunbar Creek, together, in a line, chanting, singing. Some accounts say they were led by their chief, a man whose name history did not preserve, but whose presence was commanding enough that not a single person turned back. They walked into the marsh, into the creek, into the water that rose around their ankles, their knees, their waists, their chests. They did not stop. The chant, the words that survivors and witnesses later tried to describe, was something like a prayer, a declaration, a refusal that went beyond language. Some oral accounts translated loosely as, "The water spirit brought us. The water spirit will take us home." They chose to die, every one of them, rather than live a single day in bondage on American soil. The Igbo walked into the water and did not come back. Now, I want you to sit with that for a moment. Don't rush past it, because this is not a horror detail. This is not a plot point. This is a real thing that real people did, and the weight of it should press against your chest the way it presses against the chest of everyone who stands at that creek today. They chose, in a world that had taken every choice from them, their homes, their names, their families, their freedom. They found the one choice that could not be stolen, and they made it together. That is the history. That is what happened. That is the truth that the water holds. But here is where the story shifts, because the water at Dunbar Creek, according to the people who live near it, according to the fishermen who've worked those marshes for generations, according to the researchers and visitors and historians who've gone there expecting to feel nothing, the water did not just swallow those people and move on. Something stayed. The Gullah-Geechee communities have always known this. It's not superstition to them. It's not folklore. It's a lived understanding, passed from grandmother to grandchild, that the spirits of the Igbo never left Dunbar Creek, that they are there still, that the land remembers what happened, and that the memory has teeth. Fishermen have reported hearing sounds near the creek at night, rhythmic, repetitive sounds, like chains dragging through shallow water. Not once, not twice. Consistently, over generations, different people, different decades, the same sounds. Others have reported hearing voices, not screaming, not wailing, chanting, low, steady chanting in a language they don't recognize, rising from the direction of the water when no one is there. There have been reports of figures seen at the edge of the marsh at dusk, silhouettes standing in the water, facing the east, facing Africa, unmoving. When approached, they vanish. Not dramatically, not like a movie. They just aren't there anymore, as if they were never there at all. Except the witnesses' hands are shaking and their heart is slamming against their ribs. And then there's the feeling. This is the one that comes up the most. More than the sounds, more than the sounds. The feeling. People describe it differently. Pressure on the chest, a heaviness in the legs, a sudden and overwhelming urge to cry without knowing why. Some people say they felt watched. Others say they felt held. One woman who visited the site in 2014 described it as standing inside someone else's grief. Standing inside someone else's grief. That phrase stayed with me. Now let me tell you about Marcus. Marcus Jeffries, and I'm changing his last name because he asked me to, was a 34-year-old graduate student in history at a university in Atlanta. He was working on a thesis about the cultural memory of enslaved communities along the Georgia coast, and in the spring of 2021, he traveled to St. Simon's Island to spend 2 weeks doing fieldwork, interviews, site visits, archival research at the local library. He knew about Igbo Landing. Of course he did. It was central to his research, but he told me later that he'd approached it the way he approached everything, analytically. Respectfully, yes, but from a distance, the academic distance that lets you study trauma without letting it touch you. He arrived on the island on a Tuesday, checked into a rental cottage on the east side near the lighthouse, spent the first 2 days at the library, reviewing property records and plantation ledgers and old newspaper clippings that mentioned the 1803 incident in passing, as if 75 people choosing to die was a footnote. On his third day, he drove to Dunbar Creek. He told me the drive was unremarkable. The island is beautiful. Old oaks draped with Spanish moss. Quiet roads, the smell of salt and marsh grass. He parked on a dirt pull-off near the creek and walked down a short path through the trees. And then he stopped. He said he stopped because his legs told him to stop, not his brain. His legs, they just refused to carry him forward for a moment. He described it as the feeling you get when you're walking toward the edge of a cliff and your body overrides your intention, the deep animal hesitation that has nothing to do with thought. He pushed through it. He told himself it was anticipation, the weight of knowing what happened here, the psychological pressure of standing where history collapsed into something unbearable. He reached the bank of the creek. It was low tide. The water was shallow and brown, sliding slowly through the marsh grass. The air was warm and heavy. There were no other people around, no sounds except insects and the occasional call of a bird somewhere in the trees behind him. He stood there for maybe 5 minutes, just looking at the water, taking it in, thinking about those 75 people standing in this exact spot, making the decision that no human being should ever have to make. He felt the sadness of it, and he let himself feel it, because he believed, rightly, that you can't study this history without feeling it. But then something shifted. He said the air changed, not the temperature, the texture. It became thicker, heavier, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm, except the sky was clear, and there was a pressure in his ears like he was descending in an airplane, and he swallowed hard, but it didn't clear. And then he heard it, a sound, low, rhythmic, coming from somewhere across the water, or maybe from the water itself. At first he thought it was an engine, a boat somewhere in the distance, the hum of a motor carried across the flat marsh, but it wasn't mechanical. It had, and these are his words, it had breath in it, rise and fall, like a voice, like many voices, layered on top of each other until they became a single, continuous tone. He stood perfectly still. The sound didn't get louder. It stayed at the same low, humming register, like it was hovering just at the edge of perception. If he focused on it directly, it seemed to slip away. If he let his attention soften, it came back, steady, patient, ancient. He recorded it on his phone. Later, when he played it back in his cottage, the recording was just marsh sounds, insects, water, nothing else. Whatever he'd heard wasn't on the recording. He told himself it was the wind. Acoustics playing tricks in the flat, open landscape. He wrote it up in his field notes as an auditory anomaly, likely environmental, and he moved on to his next interview. But he went back the next day. He didn't plan to. He'd scheduled an interview with a local historian for that afternoon, and he had transcription work to do in the morning. But he woke up at 5 a.m. with the creek in his head. Not a thought about the creek itself. The smell of the mud, the color of the water, the feeling of standing there. It was in him like a song he couldn't stop humming. He drove back to Dunbar Creek at dawn. The marsh was gray and silver in the early light. The water was higher. The tide was coming in. He walked to the same spot on the bank and stood there, and this time the heaviness hit him immediately. Not gradually, like the day before. Immediately, like stepping into a room where something terrible has just happened and the air is still ringing with it. And then he saw something. In the water, maybe 40 feet from the bank, a disturbance on the surface. Not a fish jumping, not a ripple from the current. A shape, darker than the water around it, moving slowly, just below the surface, parallel to the bank. He watched it for maybe 10 seconds. It moved with purpose, steady, deliberate, like something walking along the bottom. And then it stopped, and the surface of the water went absolutely still, not calm, still. There is a difference. Calm is natural. Still is the absence of all motion, and it is deeply, fundamentally wrong in moving water. Marcus said he felt his entire body go cold, not a chill, a temperature drop that started in his chest and radiated outward. His hands were shaking. His jaw was clenched so tight his teeth ached. And then the chanting started again, louder this time, clearer. Multiple voices rising and falling in unison, and this time he could hear individual words. Not understand them, but hear that they were words. A language, a real, structured language being spoken by real voices that were coming from a place where no living person stood. He ran. He told me that without shame. He turned and ran back through the trees to his car and sat in the driver's seat with the doors locked and his hands gripping the steering wheel until they stopped shaking. It took almost 20 minutes. That afternoon, he kept his interview appointment. The historian, a woman in her 70s named Mrs. Clara Dawes, a Gullah-Geechee elder who had lived on St. Lady Simmons her entire life, met him on her front porch with sweet tea and a plate of cookies, and she looked at his face and said, "You went to the creek." It wasn't a question. He nodded. She sat down slowly in her rocking chair and said, They talked to you, didn't they? And Marcus, the skeptic, the academic, the man who trusted documents and data, sat down across from her and said, "Yes, ma'am, I think they did." Mrs. Dawes told him something that afternoon that rewired his understanding of everything. She said the spirits at Dunbar Creek were not lost. They were not confused. They were not trapped. She was very clear about that. In the Gullah-Geechee understanding, those Igbo ancestors had completed their journey. They had gone home. Their spirits had crossed back over the water to Africa, just as they intended. But something remained at the creek. A mark. An imprint. Like a scar on the land itself, she said. That creek remembers what happened. The mud remembers. The water remembers. And when someone comes there with an open heart, someone who's willing to hear it, the memory speaks. She told him that the sounds people heard were not ghosts in the way horror movies use that word. They were echoes. The land playing back the last moments of those people over and over. The way a wound keeps aching long after the injury. She said the Igbo had put something into that water when they walked in. Their will, their defiance, their refusal. And it was so powerful that the water couldn't absorb it. It just held it, like a stone at the bottom that never erodes. Marcus asked her if it was dangerous. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "Not to you. Not to anyone who comes with respect. But there have been people who came to that creek with the wrong spirit. Developers. People who wanted to build on the land. People who treated it like nothing happened there. And those people, they left different than they came." Quieter. Shaken. One man, back in the 80s, tried to survey the land for a construction project. He went out to the creek with his equipment on a Monday morning. By Monday night, he was in the hospital. Couldn't stop shaking. Couldn't explain why. The project was abandoned. She leaned forward in her chair. That creek doesn't want to hurt anyone. It wants to be remembered. That's all. It wants someone to stand there and say, "I know what happened here and it mattered." That's what the voices are asking for. Recognition. Witness. Marcus spent the rest of his 2 weeks on the island conducting his research. But he went back to Dunbar Creek 4 more times. Each time the experience was different, but the core of it was the same. The heaviness, the sense of presence, the low hum of voices just beyond understanding. On his last visit, the night before he left the island, he went at dusk. He stood at the bank and he did something he'd never done in his life. He spoke to them, out loud. He said, "I hear you. I know what you did, and I will not let it be forgotten." He told me that when he said those words, the pressure in his chest, the pressure that had been there every single time he'd visited that creek, released, like a hand letting go, like a breath being exhaled after being held for 218 years. And in that release, he felt something that he could not explain in any academic paper, could not footnote or cite or quantify. He felt gratitude, not his own, theirs, a warmth that came from outside himself and moved through him like sunlight through water. And for one single crystalline moment, he understood, not intellectually, but in his blood, in his bones, what those 75 people had done. They had not surrendered. They had not given up. They had chosen, with full knowledge of what it meant, with full understanding of what they were losing and what they were refusing to become. They had chosen, and that choice, that impossible, agonizing, beautiful choice, was the most powerful act of human will he had ever encountered. He drove off the island the next morning. He finished his thesis. He got his degree. But he told me that he has never been the same person he was before he stood at that creek. Something opened in him that will not close. Something that he doesn't want to close. And here is the part that I promised you. The part that broke me when he told me. About 6 months after he returned to Atlanta, he was in his apartment late at night grading papers. The windows were closed. The TV was off. The building was quiet. And he heard it. The chanting. Faint, faint, far away. Like it was coming from the bottom of a well or from across an ocean, but unmistakable. The same voices, the same rhythm, the same words he couldn't understand but could feel in the marrow of his bones. He sat very still. He didn't run this time. He listened, and he realized something. The chanting wasn't coming from outside. It wasn't coming from the walls or the floor or the window. It was coming from inside him. They had followed him home, not to haunt him, not to torment him, but because he had done what they asked. He had witnessed. He had listened. He had said their story out loud. And in doing so, he had become part of it, a link in a chain that stretched back across centuries and oceans, connecting the living to the dead, the present to the past, the witness to the witnessed. He carries them now. Their story lives in him, and every time he tells it, every time someone hears it and feels that pressure in their chest, that heaviness, that urge to cry without knowing why, the chain grows longer, the memory grows stronger, the water remembers a little more. Mrs. Dawes told him something else on that porch, something he didn't share with me until the very end of our conversation. She said the Gullah-Geechee elders believe that when enough people remember, when enough people carry the story and speak it and refuse to let it be buried, the Igbo will finally be at rest, not because they'll be forgotten, but because they'll be known, fully, completely, by the living world that owes them that much. She said, they're still chanting because the world hasn't finished listening. So I'm asking you now, right now, wherever you are, whatever time it is, whatever you're doing, are you listening? Because Dunbar Creek is still there. The water is still moving. The mud is still holding on to something that happened on a May morning in 1803, when 75 people stood at the edge of the only choice they had left and walked forward together. And if you ever go to St. Simon's Island, if you ever stand at the edge of that creek and feel the air go heavy and hear something just beneath the surface of silence, don't run. Stand still. Listen, because they have been waiting 222 years for someone to hear them, and the water still remembers.